Simon, the following account is slightly shortened but otherwise unchanged and comes from my diary record for Tuesday 31st of October 1978. Only the names have been changed. We were all aged between 15 and 17 at the time. The Luce Valley referred to is near Maidstone in Kent. My diary record also indicates that there was a new moon on that night. I will record a rather unpleasant experience which took place tonight. A group of about 10 of us were sitting chatting in the Luce Valley at about midnight. After about 45 minutes, Will leapt to his feet, slapping his head, saying there was a bee in his hair. He looked absolutely terrified. Both Dorothy and I saw the outline of a tall, thin figure wearing a hat dancing behind him. Will said later it was as if a terrifically loud buzzing was coming up through the top of his head. However, only Rachel heard any buzzing. We partially satisfied ourselves that it must have been a bee's nest, and so we moved a little distance away. As we moved away, Dorothy and I saw a ring outlined in the grass which enclosed where we had been sitting. Eventually it started raining, so we headed for Rachel's house. As we left, I turned around and saw the same thin black figure walk across the opening between the trees to where we had been sitting. We had been sitting in Rachel's bedroom for a while, when I looked at Will, who was reading, and saw an amorphous black blob drop out of his hair onto the bed. I was the only one who saw this. A few seconds later, a black shape started whizzing around. The main movement was from bottom left to top right as I was sitting, getting larger during the movement and inducing a great fright. About 4 people altogether saw this. Later the girls slept in a room together. Apparently Rachel and Molly saw the black blob in the curtains during the night. I, however, had an excellent night's sleep. On first awakening I saw the thin black figure silhouetted against the wardrobe doors. I must admit I lost my calm last night and was bloody terrified by the whole thing. I have now moved away from the southeast, but I occasionally meet Will. Even 20 years later he has been extremely unwilling to discuss the events of that night in any detail, as he still found the memory disturbing. During our last meeting I gained a little more of his account. He was not aware of the thin figure which I saw behind him during the initially buzzing. Unprompted by me, he did recall the black blob falling out of his hair, which I thought I alone witnessed. However, he recalls it dropping onto the pages of the book he was reading rather than onto the bed, as I recalled. Will also recalls more of the girls' account of their night after retiring. Apparently the blob had several times appeared near the curtains and moved them, while silhouetted against a bright light which appeared to come from outside but did not correspond to any street lamp or likely car lights. This has been the only supernatural experience of my life. Stickmen and Mediums autobiographies? Despite the total lack of evidence I've managed to gather since posting this on another thread, I'm positive that either Betty Shine or Doris Stokes mentions, in her autobiography, seeing a stickman made out of the landscape more than once during her youth. My memory of the actual description, and, indeed, source, is iffy. I read this in my early teens. My parents owned both books, but it was definitely in one of them. I wasn't a big fan of clairvoyance. It was just a long, boring summer, and I had nothing to read, and it made a lasting impression on me. As far as I can remember, Doris, or Betty, is on a journey somewhere when she looks out of her window and sees a giant stick figure bounding along the landscape, keeping up with the car/train/whatever, and it appeared to make itself out of whatever bit of landscape it was passing at the time. Fields, trees, bridges, etc. Eek. Doris/Betty, or Boris, if you prefer, seemed to find this quite peaceful and reassuring, but I was deeply terrified, and soon gave up my habit of staring dreamily out of the window on long car journeys. Even now it gives me a bit of a chill if I think about it.
Black Cutout Man in SC London. This is my first post. I wanted to share an experience that happened to me some years ago, for which I have no explanation, but still to this day I'd like to see if anyone out there has any ideas to contribute. The fact that I stumbled across these accounts on the FT website of black silhouette figures confirms a lot to me, namely that myself and a friend are not alone in something we experienced. Please read on. I was walking from a friend's house to my own, in the early hours of the morning after a night of general chat while I was at university here in London, UK specifically, a relatively leafy suburb called Brockley in southeast London. I had drunk only everyday tea or soft drinks all night and had consumed no drugs whatsoever. I'd simply gone without sleep. The time was around 6 a.m. and dawn was literally breaking when a friend and I found ourselves walking down my street to where my apartment was located, when we saw a figure walking up the street towards us. The word we coined later to describe its movement was lolloping, a kind of up-down bouncy walk. It took a few seconds for the two of us to realize this was no human being. I asked my friend, "See that man?" "Yes," was the reply. It's not a man, though, is it? I found myself asking. No, said my friend, sounding scared. It isn't. The creature was entirely black and like a cardboard cutout, flat and one-dimensional. It had no features at all, and it had arms that hung down to its knees. It seemed to be ignoring us, then it seemed to realize we could see it and it began to lollop faster towards us. We ran to my front door and hid in the hallway as quiet and unmoving as possible. When we saw the thing, we felt it was male, approach the front door and appear to look through the glass from the way its head moved up and down and around. It then turned away. We didn't sleep for some time after that, discussing what we saw. It was shaped like many descriptions of greys, but both myself and my friend came away with the impression that what we saw was either of this world or from another parallel dimension. To all intents and purposes, it appeared to be sauntering along the road enjoying the walk before it became shocked to see us staring at it in horror. We instinctively felt this was not a creature to try and communicate with, this was not something that it was good to be near. We might have been wrong, but neither myself nor my friend would ever like to see this creature or others like it again, though I'd love to get some ideas on what it was. We felt that if this creature had somehow gotten hold of us, we would not be around today to tell the tale to anyone who might believe us or at least give the story open-minded consideration. So, sorry for the long first post, but what do you think? Andy Hinkinson Hodnett.
Saw this report and it reminded me of this thread. My sister and her friends described what they saw to me on May 2, 2003. Party out at her house out in the country at 3:30 a.m. There were almost 20 kids there. They had set a fire in between the house and an adjacent field. The party wound down at around 2:45 in the morning. My sister, who is 17, and her two friends started to clean up. They were unloading some chairs when my sister saw a figure standing a little off the driveway by the house. She motioned her friend to look. They were a little scared, so they jumped into the van. Once in the van, they looked back up towards the house, and the figure was gone. My sister described it as appearing to look like maybe it was a man, and it had lighter colored, or white clothing on. Once the van was started, they all convinced each other that the figure or person was probably E's dad just checking up on them. They then headed back down towards the fire to resume cleaning. About 3:20 a.m., they headed up the driveway and into the grass, and down the hill towards the fire, which was still burning. The van's bright lights lit up frozen things. There were strange figures or creatures or something in two separate rows. She says maybe 15 in each row, and 30 in all. She said, they were 3 feet to 4 feet tall. They were directly in front of the car, about 15 feet away from them. She describes them as having a Christmas light head, and that the heads were connected to the body, but she couldn't see how. She says their arms were up, but she couldn't see hands. She says they were stick-like. Stick people, she says. Dark gray or brown in color. They didn't move. Not at all, she says. She says they were just frozen in these 2 separate rows. My sister immediately began to cry, and then both girls screamed for E to get the car moving. She peeled out and they headed to town. The girls drove around for 2 hours until they finally got enough courage to go back as the sun came up. She hasn't been able to sleep, or eat, and when she told us what happened she could barely finish the story because she was fighting back tears. To say that she was shaken up is an understatement. Thanks to Peter Davenport, National UFO Reporting Center.
This is excellent. I saw 3 thin dark beings walking right in the middle of the dirt road in front of our farmhouse when I was a kid. Just for the record, this is the same farm that I had a UFO sighting at, but I think this tall dark thin beings thing was a couple of years later. I was myself out in the road, probably because I like to visit/experiment on/antagonize the large red ant den there. I remember looking down the road and distinctly seeing the 3 figures, who seemed to be walking abreast and coming in my direction. They weren't all the exact same height, but within a few inches anyway. They seemed to be well over 6 feet tall. It was a typical, normal summer day. And strangely enough, they did seem to be lolloping along as described in another post. I remember thinking that it must be the neighbors from down the road coming to visit or something, and looked away for a moment but felt uneasy because there was some strange feeling that something wasn't right. They shouldn't have seemed so tall and dark. So I looked again in the direction they had been, and they were gone. I had only looked away for a couple of seconds. It really frightened me, and to this day I distinctly remember this episode and get the shivers. I never could explain it. I'm glad to hear of other similar things from other people, whatever it may be. When I was going to art school, I stayed in this really crappy place the school was using for first-year student housing. There were 4 of us living in the cramped attic of this place. Anyway, late one night I was coming up the stairs to hit the sack when I saw this thing standing over my sleeping roommate. It looked kind of like the robots from the end of AI, only black and less ropey. It didn't seem to have any highlights on it showing much depth, but there was a light behind it that probably didn't help. It didn't pay me any mind either, it was just focused on my roommate. For some reason it just didn't seem out of the ordinary to me at the time, and I got into bed and went to sleep. The whole thing just didn't hit me as important until the next day when I told him about it. I think I kind of freaked him out. About a week later he left the school in the middle of the night, leaving all of his possessions behind. Never saw it again.
Stick-like entity. These stories bring back a memory of an event that happened to me about 3 years ago. My family and I were returning home by van after a visit to the relatives. My oldest son was driving and I was in the passenger seat to supervise him. It was sept, and sunset was about an hour away with partly cloudy skies. Although cool, the country road was clear and dry with good visibility. We were about 5 miles from home and approaching an intersection notorious for traffic fatalities. So I stopped my day dreaming and focused on the intersection ahead to look for potential trouble, such as approaching vehicles that failed to observe the stop signs, when it caught my eye. It first appeared, 150 meters, to be a dark figure on a bike on our side of the road, just to the other side of the intersection. I told my son to slow down from the 55 miles per hour we were traveling. As we got closer I noticed that this thing was not on a bike, nor was it a deer that we usually hit that time of year. I judged its height at about 8 to 9 feet, and it turned, or should I say more of a rotational jump, to look in our direction. It was dark gray and with long, gangly, almost tubular limbs. The arms seemed to reach to the ground, although it seemed upright. The human-like head was a lighter color with a pointed face. If there was a torso to it, it was small, as the head appeared to end almost at the conjunction of the limbs. At this point my emotions came to life. I had the intense feeling that this thing was very aware of my noticing it and that it was somewhat surprised by the fact. I also had a feeling of dread, as if there was an inherent maliciousness to it. We are now less than 50 meters away at this time. At this point it bolted across the road in less than a second and traveled along the opposite shoulder, then off the road into an open field at a speed faster than any deer I have hunted. The best way to describe its locomotion would be like that of an arachnid. I followed it with my eyes until it went into a nearby woodlot. My son asked me, "What the hell was that?" After being left speechless for a second I said that I had no idea, but it definitely was not a deer or person. Way too big and fast. We pulled over and scanned the woods and field for signs of it, or anything else for that matter, but with no success. Although I saw it very clearly, I still have a difficult time trying to put its description into words. There was one thing I saw in the sci-fi movie, Lost in Space, that reminded me of what I had seen. That would have been the Dr. Smith character that had transformed into a spider-like creature.
These kind of reports have a charm made out of combining the utterly surreal with the somehow sympathetic and believable. But one thing that gets me is how they happen to people at random, unexpected, as though you'd expect, times. I mean, I look, and as I've posted about before, I haven't seen a whole lot of anything I'm willing to count as actual phenomena, versus sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations for instance. It would be interesting to see if there are time overlaps in the sightings, though we already have a noon and early morning account. The first, the morning encounter, got me thinking about how the center AMs seem to occupy their own little dimension. I wonder if shift workers might have more Fortean events to report than day workers.
Hi. I am new to this message board and enjoy reading the experiences posted here. Anyways, I saved this story on my computer 2 to 3 years ago. Stick Indians. by ladybug1137@home.com. Not many people have heard of them. No one knows if they truly exist, but I believe they do. There are reports in the Colville Reservation in Washington state, but Colville natives won't talk about it. I have never personally encountered them, but family members have, and I don't believe they would lie about such phenomena. Anyway, Stick Indians, so I have heard, are extremely tall beings who do not speak in words, but in creaks, howls, and whistles. They are only out at night in the woods of Colville, near Disatell Pass. They live along creeks and streams and have been known to steal fish from fishermen in the area, and people out in the open. My uncle and his wife's family were camping up in that particular area one night. They had 2 tents. One for him and his wife, and another for her parents. They were camped near a stream and were fishing all day. That night they heard strange noises, whistles and weird clicking noises, like that of a human. My uncle stuck his head out of his tent to see what was going on when he saw 4 or 5 extremely tall, and very thin creatures on 2 legs, over by their fishnets signaling back and forth to each other. My uncle was terrified, but he quickly ran to his in-laws' tent and asked them what was going on. The father told him to lie down and shut up. That they were Stick Indians and if they made too much noise they might be attacked. He said no one had ever survived an encounter with them and to just be still. As long as they didn't know they were there they would be fine. When my uncle came home he was so terrified. He still, to this day, will not go near Disatell Pass. If he goes fishing, he goes in the morning and is home at least a couple hours before dark.
The Black Thing. This seems to be the place to finally tell of the Black Thing, as it seems similar to the original post, and I like the idea of the events being written down in some form. In 1993 I lived with 4 other guys in a townhouse while we were in university. Over the 2 years we spent there myself and my roommates got to know the Black Thing. Downstairs was the living room, and there was a couch facing the opposite wall where the TV was. Occasionally, as we sat around watching TV, one person would see a small black blob shape materialize and move from left to right across the room, and disappear before it hit the opposite wall. This happened on numerous occasions, and though only one person would see it at a time, we all saw it at one time or another. We simply called it the Black Thing. And kind of got used to it. There was no feeling of dread, or cold, or anything unusual really. Other than this black blob moving across the room. We would even have guests come over. This happened twice to 2 different people, and while sitting there would suddenly say something like "What the hell was that?" We would then find out they had seen a black shape moving across the room, and we told them we knew it was there, and that we just called it the Black Thing. A bit weird, but it definitely happened to me as well as at least 6 other people in our apartment.
Fantastic link, Shaw. That site attributes a lot of the same sort of features to Stick Indians. I wanted to write stick insects there, that your classic Old English elves used to get misdirection, mischief verging on malevolence, panic or paralysis induction, CF pan and ELF shot, appearance to lonely travelers, stealing young children, etc. At the very least, this implies that humans living around woods tend to make up the same kind of myths. And how about this account from that page? I had one other strange experience in these same mountains. It was with the sweet Ihama. 2 of them came one night and without ceremony shared my blankets. One on either side. I was so wedged that I could not turn. I knew not how they came, nor how they left. No. It was not imagination. It was real, for I was awake and fully conscious of my surroundings. I know no explanation, have no theory to offer in either case of the strange phenomena. I do, that's classic sleep paralysis by the sound of it, not dissimilar to many cases reported on this very site. Anyway, there's a creepiness to it all, very like that of them thar elves. That was a stick engine crying in the woods, whatever it could be, it was drawing in on me. BRRR. Makes a shiver run down me spine, so it does. I found the following story on and it reminded me of the black stick men described on this thread. 17. Location: Elkader, Iowa. Date: February 15, 2004. Time: 2300. The witness was returning to her house after finishing a late night farm chore when something caught her eye as she almost reached her door. To her left she saw a thing running very fast about 30 yards away from her. Not comprehending what she was seeing, she could only describe the entity as looking like a stick man. It seemed to turn its head over his left shoulder and look straight at her, and then it took off in a sprint towards her front door. Very upset, the witness ran inside and locked all the doors. It took her 2 hours to calm down. She began to sob so hard that she started to hyperventilate. She never told anyone, including her family, about what she had seen. She felt that the thing wanted her to see it, for some unknown reason. Source, New Fork type.
Direwolf men versus shadow men. I'm confused by the posts here, which seem to treat shadow men and stick men on a one-to-one basis. To me, they are quite distinct entities. Shadow people strike me as rather ethereal in nature, although probably not ghosts in the usual nature of that word. The best hypotheses I've yet heard to explain their existence is that they are quite literally the shadows thrown into our world by people moving normally through other dimensions or times. The inhabitants of those worlds may very well regard us as their shadow people. Stick people, on the other hand, seem much more cryptpzoological in nature. They seem much more solid than the shadows, and to be markedly insectoid, which the shadows in general are not.
Shadowman or Stickman? Or just a very thin alien? Location: Ivanova, Russia. Date: January 1, 2004. Time: 0100. At a main witness and two friends were celebrating the advent of a new year, but had only drunk a little bit of champagne and were out walking the streets. The men suddenly noticed a large orange sphere that seemed to descend and approach their position. The sphere then hovered above some nearby fir trees. As the men stared at it, the main witness looked around and spotted a strange person some meters away, which immediately he realized that it was not normal or human. It had what appeared to be a snout and was staring at the witness in a mocking grin. It then turned sideways and the witness was stunned to see that completely flat in appearance, like it had been run over by an asphalt roller. At this time the witness felt a strong invisible wave that struck him and knocked him down against the icy ground. As he got up the sphere and the strange humanoid had disappeared, he turned to his friends, who apparently had not seen the humanoid but saw the orange sphere. HC Addendum Source: Ex Libri UFO Russia, quoting Chronometer Magazine 113/2004.
Hi to all, I have just been reading this thread with interest as about 2 years ago I posted a story, though not fiction obviously, on here about an experience my husband had at work which seems to tie in with these other stick men experiences. He was a shunter on the railway and had just gone to the cabin at about 4 a.m. for a break when he heard dragging loud footsteps following him. Now this cabin and rail yard is in the middle of nowhere. Fields all around, no a soul to be seen, and it is spooky enough in the daylight, but my hubby is not one to scare easily, and so he thought nothing of it, imagining it was just a fox or escaped pig, or something. Inside the cabin though, he was suddenly overcome with this awful sense of foreboding and fear as he had lay down for a quick 10 minutes nap between trains, and suddenly he heard the footsteps right outside the door. It was a full moon and so the window was illuminated, and as he crouched on the bed in terror he distinctly saw a weird shape passing the window. He described it as like somebody being bent over, walking with their arm bent, holding onto the window ledge. Nothing wrong with that, except that the body was stick-like and brown and the arm was like a twiglet, to phrase him, like a knobbly brown branch bent at the elbow. The door handle turned and Hubs nearly fainted with fear, but then suddenly the breathing stopped and he just felt it was safe again. He ran to the door, bearing in mind that the vista is so that you can see anybody walking away for quite some distance. It had been a matter of seconds since the breathing and door rattling had stopped, but there was nobody to be seen all around. Whatever it was had just vanished into thin air. To add a footnote to this story, he later that week had to ride on one of the trains with a driver for a mile or so up the line, and this particular driver used to always lock the doors to the cab. None of the others did, as it is in the middle of nowhere as stated. Hubby asked him why he always locked the doors and received a strange long look from the driver, who asked Hubs why he asked. He, being macho, laughed it off and said no reason, and the driver just answered that strange things happened at night around them parts. I wonder what he had experienced. Hubby still gets a shiver when he thinks of that night and cannot explain it at all.
Stick people in Illinois. My personal favorite Stickmen account comes from Illinois, and not all that long ago. The events supposedly transpired on May 2, 2003. Another source says May 3rd. The fact that the events reportedly occurred at 3:30 a.m. may account for this discrepancy. A group of teenagers held a party in a large backyard which abutted an open field. The centerpiece of the festivities was a large, roaring bonfire. As the teen hosts began cleaning up after the party, They noticed that approximately 30 stick people had gathered around the still burning fire. They were each between 3 and 4 feet tall and stood arranged in 2 rows of about 15 each. Alas, that's all I know about this one. But it seems an odd thing to make up.
I find this thread very interesting and want to share an experience that happened to me about 25 years ago. I was living in Monahans, Texas, and my family and I were just returning from an evening church service. We were renting a small home on a corner lot with a detached garage. We were just returning and I was carrying my son who was not yet a year old, and as I approached the back door I could see through the bathroom window into the master bedroom. There was a lamp turned on inside on the bureau, and as I looked in I saw a black silhouette turn around the corner and run into the bedroom. 3 things struck me at the same time. First was that we had an intruder, second was the fact that the intruder had absolutely no features. He was a black silhouette, like a shadow, except for the fact that when he ran in front of the lamp the light did not pass through him, so he had substance, but no dimension, flat and totally black. Third, I instinctively knew the intruder was masculine. I immediately handed my son to my wife and went into the house searching for an intruder and found no one inside. There was no exit from the bedroom other than the window, and my wife and other children remained outside while I went in, and no one left the house. I do want to add that we had been experiencing some other odd goings on in this house prior to and after this experience and moved not long after. When I related this story to a lady friend several years later, she exclaimed rather excitedly, "The gingerbread man." It seems she and her sister had seen a very similar being in another place, but that is her story to tell.
I've been meaning to relay this personal story for some time now, but never really got around to it. It was the early 1960s. As a child of around 4 or 5 or so, I have a memory of seeing this exact same thing. I was on a drive with my family. We were poor and our only entertainment on Sundays was the Sunday afternoon drive. Gas at that time was much less expensive in those days and, in comparison with other entertainments like going to the movies or out to dinner, much easier on the wallet for my father to bear. This particular afternoon, I remember not feeling well. Very tired and cranky, and not wanting to ride in the car. I looked out the window and saw the stickman running alongside, keeping pace with our car. He seemed to be made out of the trees and stone walls and buildings and meadows. I tried to point it out to my brother, but he said nothing was there and to not be stupid. Suddenly the stickman ran toward the car, as though it were about to collide with our car. I remember feeling that weird sensation of he's going to get us. When he hit the car, of course nothing really happened. A short while later down the road, the entire stickman episode happened again, and again the rest of my entire family totally discounted my comments. Come to find out I had the flu and an accompanying 102-degree temperature and ended up sick for a few days. All this time I have wondered if the experience was real, or was the entire episode made up of a young mind warped by fever? Did the fever along with my young mind somehow open a doorway into another reality? Was it a hallucination? Why would the hallucination be so similar as others who had seen and talked about? It all seems weirdly coincidental that what I saw was also seen by another, but who was not apparently sick. Any thoughts?
Interesting, and I think I know what you mean. A few years back at a party with some friends I was offered salvia. Having never done it before, I was willing to give it a try. A couple seconds after inhaling, the strangest, most indescribably feeling overcame me. It felt like I was half in this world, half in another. Anyways, when I looked at the wall some distance in front of me, all I could see was a giant man's head, somewhat 2D. The killer thing here is that he was made of the various objects on or near the wall, a stereo shelving unit, a poster, a lamp, etc., but was very distinct, not like a mosaic, but like an actual head. I can only describe it as my perspective being skewed in a way that is difficult to comprehend. As if in my normal reality my mind separated this man's head into component parts, but in that distinct, alternate view, it really was a man's head, and the components were merely virtual. Well, I've smoked the concentrated stuff that you can buy at smoke shops. I've done it twice and both times were stranger than the strangest thing you can imagine. I don't recommend screwing with it for too long as I don't know the lasting effects. One interesting thing is, when I smoked it, I couldn't shake this definitive feeling that I was leaning so far to the left that I was about to fall over. I was actually standing straight up. As far as I know, there are different plants that fall into the Salvia category, but aren't the kind you smoke. Not too sure on specifics, but Salvia divinorum is what you buy in shops. Gynoid not sure where sage came from. Did I miss a post? That picture is somewhat like what I meant, but objects lose their sense of distance and become a homogeneous whole, as opposed to a picture made out of other pictures. In your picture, I can easily distinguish both the entire picture and the elements making it up. Now imagine those elements disappearing and only the face remains. Also, imagine that when the face disappears and the elements remain, they look nothing like the face. It's an either-or kind of thing. Having just looked up pareidolia, I guess that's similar. It's kinda hard to say.
I saw something similar to a stickman about 3 years ago. It was late at night and I was on my own. It was too hot to sleep and I wasn't the least bit tired, so I just pottered about with the front door wide open to let a breeze through the flat. As I went to walk into my hall, I saw what I can only describe as an outline of a person walking towards my bedroom. The outline looked like it was made up of white tape. This figure seemed to be not much taller than myself, so about 5 feet 5. It really made me jump, and as I cried out it disappeared. My first thought was that someone had got into the flat through the open door, so I began to check room to room, which for a small flat didn't take long. Nothing was found. It then dawned on me what I saw, and no living person looks that way. It was as if I'd caught whatever it was taking a stroll through my flat.
It happened to me. Just last month I had an experience. It was Saturday, June 7th. I drove up Farm Road 3009 here in Shirts to my local Walmart to get a few things before I went to the San Antonio Botanical Gardens and the movies. Well, I bought my kitties their cat food and a few other things. To go home I went down the Interstate 35 access road and crossed over the highway and drove down Shirts Parkway. When I got near Wiederstein Road, I just happened to glance down the road and saw the strangest thing. It was this tall, solid black humanoid figure, and crouching next to it was another black humanoid shape. It was as if the one figure was trying to catch its breath and the other was watching for any cars coming down the road. These figures were solid black, no features, and reminded me of the figures they have on crosswalk signs saying walk. I wasn't sure what I was seeing and thought of turning around and going back to see if they were still there, but remembered I had some frozen TV dinners with me, so I just went home. This was around 8:30 a.m. or so. Haven't seen it since. By the way, there are no houses on this stretch of Wiederstein Road. More towards where the road joins Farm to Market Road 1518 there are homes, but not in the area I saw the black figures. There are deer, raccoons, skunks and other animals around there, and these were no animal.
I think the following story belongs here. Relevant section. My sister looked up and saw what she describes as frozen things. Figures or creatures or something in 2 separate rows. She says maybe 15 in each row, and 30 in all. She said they were approximately 3 feet to 4 feet tall. And she said they were about 15 feet away from them, directly in front of the car. She describes them as having a Christmas light head, and that the heads were connected to the body but she couldn't see how. She says their arms were up, but she couldn't see hands. She says they were stick-like. Stick people, she says, dark gray or brown in color. They didn't move. Not at all, she says. She says they were just frozen in these 2 separate rows.
An elderly relation of mine still sticks to a story of her encounter with a small creature/person/thing. One night she heard a noise on the landing as she was laying in bed reading. She began to notice a tip-tap type sound getting closer to the bedroom. She thought it was a cat or rat, and so, being a very brave woman, she prepared herself to surprise this visitor. The tip-tap noise had stopped by now and all was silent again. Laying on her side, facing away from the direction of the door, she suddenly felt something small on the bed. She turned with book in hand ready to hit whatever it was and saw it rush for the door. Before I continue, can I tell all readers that this tale told to me has never changed over time. As a child she told me the same story she would now if I asked her. I personally believe that she did what I now go on to describe. The thing rushing to the door was in fact running on two thin small legs. Its body was bloated but limbs and neck were long and thin. She describes the hands as looking too large for the arms with long floppy fingers. It appeared naked to her, as it wore no clothing. Its skin looked milky pale. It looked in a state of panic as it ran straight at the door and passed through it. This visitor was no taller than a milk bottle. She never saw it again, but it spooked her for a while. These days, in the modern era of little green men coming from outer space, she sometimes points out a picture in a magazine of newspaper of what is supposed to be the gray type being associated with abductions. She scoffs at these images, saying it looks similar to her experience. The arms and legs look familiar, but the main body is too thin compared to what she saw.
This is going back quite a few years now, but we wrote it down to make sure we didn't forget. We were sharing a room, trying to get asleep. My brother was pretty frantically whispering to get my attention. I rolled over in my bed to see what was up, and it was standing in the middle of our room. It was dark but very clearly silhouetted, gave off very bad vibes. Whatever it was not good. Then it walked through the bedroom wall and we never saw it again. My brother saw it for a little bit longer than me, but we both described the same thing, both what we saw and felt. Couldn't have lasted longer than a few minutes before it went. I've read most of what written here, but there doesn't seem to be an answer to what they are. Here is my experience. Maybe it will help someone figure out what they are. Early November 1978, Idyllwild, California. Idyllwild is a forested town on top of a mountain range, very beautiful. Perhaps there was an Indian/Native American history, I don't know. I was 12. I'm 51 now. That day a senior coerced my roommate and myself into hiking up into the hills and drinking Southern Comfort. I was very nervous about the whole thing. I hadn't had alcohol before and I worried that I would become alcoholic. I have no idea why I was so sure that would happen, but it actually did, which is not as weird as the black Stickmen, but close enough. I've been sober 30 years now. We drank, I got drunk. In my drunkenness I ran back through the forest to the campus alone. I was scared of something, I don't remember what at all, but I ran faster. For some reason I turned around and in a clearing I saw 6 or 7 black stick figure men. I froze and burst into tears, staring at them. They stopped. One stepped forward, and I started running again while looking backwards, crying. I thought they were devils, but they didn't seem evil. Maybe it was their shape or posture. But the one that stepped forward seemed boyish to me. He looked my way, but I didn't sense he was that aware of me, even though it seemed like they had been chasing me before. This is weird. But I found him attractive, in a 12-year-old girl way. Something in the way he moved. I was terrified and my mind definitely thought they were devils, but in retrospect and perhaps even then, they didn't seem evil. Maybe they were lost. I ran back to school, and that was that. I was drunken, but I never saw anything that wasn't real ever again while drinking. I do not have mental illness. It was real. I've told maybe 2 or 3 people over the course of my life. And naughty feel it, I guess he was 17. I was just trying to explain my mindset before the sighting. It was a weird thing for him to do, but whatever. He didn't assault us. He was probably just a weird lonely kid. I didn't like him or dislike him. There weren't any legends in the area that I had heard of, but we were in boarding school. Not part of town life, so who knows? At Henry I wouldn't be able to place it on a map, but if I were there I could probably retrace my route. We were in the hills above the town and I ran back to school through the forest, not the main road because I didn't want to get caught for drinking. I may have veered around, but there was only one route and I didn't get lost. I don't think the older boy had anything to do with the sighting beyond making me a little nervous, and perhaps in that nervousness making me more receptive to seeing the sick man. It wasn't called Idyllwild School. The school is still there, but it has a different name from the one I attended. I spent an hour reading about black stickmen last night after making the post here, and I remembered more of the incident. I think I may have figured it out. They weren't like a child's drawing of stickmen. They were elegantly shaped and their heads were more oval than circular, and their heads were not oversized. They looked to be about my height, which would have been about 5.5 at the time. They weren't aware of my physical presence, of that I'm sure, because when I stopped for a moment, they stopped, and one of them stepped ahead of the others and looked around. They don't have eyes, so looking around probably isn't the most accurate way to describe it. I think they sensed my energy, and when I stopped running, they lost track of it. I was in a drunken, overly emotional state, running through a forest. I'm sure I was giving off a lot of energy. I thought they were devils because my mind couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, but they weren't giving off an evil vibe at all. Also, When I got back to school, I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I wasn't scared of being disbelieved. It just didn't seem relevant. If I were scared of them as an evil presence, I think I would have mentioned it someone. So, I have two theories. One, I was a child and scared. My mind played a trick on me. The only problem with this theory is that I think I would have other bizarre experiences in my life, and I haven't had any. I've heard weird noises at night, but that's about it. And most likely, everyone on Earth has heard weird noises at night. It's not a unique or interesting experience. 2, they're protective forest spirits. Their shape is simple and possibly triggered by emotional or sleepy minds. I would imagine they're not visible otherwise, or else there would be a mountain of sightings. I read one story last night where the writer claimed that stick figure had come into their home and tickled them. I think that's silly.